Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast, Season 10. Teaching the Designer, Chapter 1, Before Schools. This season is called Teaching the Designer. Over the next 10 episodes, we will explore design education not as a history of schools, universities, qualifications, or professional accreditation, but as a much longer human story about how knowledge is transferred from one generation to another. Long before design became an academic discipline, a profession, or a specialized field of study, human beings were already teaching one another how to shape objects, construct environments, solve practical problems, and engage creatively with the world around them. This season, therefore, does not begin with institutions, classrooms, or curricula, but with a more fundamental question: how did people learn to design before schools existed? Throughout the season, we will move from informal learning to organized instruction, from workshops to academies, from apprenticeships to universities, and from traditional forms of teaching to the emerging challenges posed by a digital and increasingly automated world. Because before design education became a formal system, it was first a cultural process. The history of teaching design is therefore not limited to educational institutions, but is connected to the broader history of how societies preserve, share, adapt, and transmit knowledge. To understand design education in this way is to study not only schools, but the continuous evolution of learning itself. Design education is often discussed through the language of institutions. Histories of design teaching are typically organized around famous schools, influential pedagogical movements, celebrated educators, and recognized qualifications, creating the impression that design education begins only when formal structures emerge. Within this framework, earlier forms of learning are frequently treated as preliminary stages, rather than educational systems in their own right. Informal observation, collective practice, imitation, experimentation, and apprenticeship are often described as precursors to education rather than education itself. As a result, design learning becomes narrowly associated with classrooms, curricula, and certification, while the deeper question of how humans first acquired and transmitted design knowledge remains insufficiently examined. This limitation arises in part from how modern societies define education. Learning is frequently measured through institutions, documented through qualifications, and validated through formal assessment. Yet this perspective risks reducing education to its administrative structures rather than understanding it as a broader process through which knowledge, skills, values, and practices are passed between people. When education is approached only through schools, the long history that precedes them begins to disappear from view. However, the origins of design learning cannot be reduced to the origins of educational institutions alone. Before universities existed, before design schools emerged, and before professional disciplines were formally recognized, human beings were already teaching one another how to make, adapt, improve, and create. A parent showing a child how to shape a tool, a craftsperson demonstrating a technique, or a community repeating construction practices across generations may appear ordinary from the perspective of educational history. Yet each represents an act of teaching. These acts transformed individual experience into shared knowledge. In this sense, design education begins not with schools, but with the conscious transmission of practical and creative understanding. This distinction is important because knowledge does not emerge automatically. Every society depends on mechanisms that preserve experience and enable its transfer to others. Human communities differ from many other forms of life not simply because they learn, but because they accumulate, refine, and communicate knowledge across generations. Learning gradually became more than imitation. It became connected to culture, memory, identity, cooperation, and collective development. Skills ceased to belong solely to individuals and increasingly became shared social resources. Design knowledge, therefore, emerged not simply because people needed practical solutions, but because communities recognized the value of preserving successful practices and passing them forward. At this point, the relationship between design and education becomes inseparable. Early learning environments were certainly shaped by immediate needs such as survival, production, and adaptation. Yet even the most basic examples of knowledge transfer reveal social structures extending beyond practical necessity. Observation, repetition, mentorship, correction, and demonstration all suggest that humans were beginning to organize learning intentionally. Knowledge was no longer accidental, it was becoming structured. This transition also marks an important shift in how societies relate to expertise. In earlier conditions, knowledge was often embedded directly within daily life. Learning occurred through participation rather than formal instruction. Over time, however, certain individuals began to acquire specialized skills and to transmit them systematically. expertise no longer depended entirely on personal experience. It increasingly became something that could be taught. This transformation represents one of the deepest foundations of education because it marks the moment when societies moved beyond individual learning and began to create collective systems for the transmission of knowledge. At the same time, these early forms of teaching should not be understood through modern assumptions about educators and students. There were no lecturers, professors, examinations, or degrees. Learning was embedded within everyday activities and inseparable from work, family, and community life. Knowledge emerged through observation, repetition, participation, and practice rather than through formal theory. Skills were not organized into modules or programs, but developed through continuous engagement with real situations. This is why the origins of design education are inseparable from the origins of craft traditions. Long before educational institutions appeared, communities were already developing sophisticated ways of transmitting knowledge through shared experience. Materials, tools, techniques, and construction methods were not merely practical resources, but vehicles through which knowledge traveled across generations. Early acts of teaching, therefore, represent more than technical instruction. They reveal the beginnings of educational culture itself. In this sense, the first lessons were fundamentally social. Design education emerged not only from the desire to improve skills, but from the necessity of ensuring that knowledge survived beyond a single lifetime. Such environments also challenge the dominance of institutional thinking within educational discourse. Contemporary education is often discussed in terms of schools, qualifications, and administrative systems that privilege formal structures over lived experience. Yet the earliest learning environments were experienced primarily through participation, observation, correction, experimentation, and collaboration rather than organized curricula. Their importance lay less in where learning occurred and more in how knowledge was shared. Education, at its origin, was relational before it became institutional. Once this perspective is adopted, teaching begins to appear not as a specialized activity, but as a fundamental human behavior. The transition from informal learning to organized education did not occur instantly, nor was a single innovation responsible for it. Instead, it emerged through countless acts of guidance, demonstration, and shared experience repeated across generations. Teaching, therefore, developed not through institutions alone, but through collective human interaction. Its origins are found throughout everyday life. Understanding this changes how we define educational beginnings. The question is no longer, what was the first school, but rather, when did humans begin intentionally transmitting knowledge to others? This shift may appear subtle, yet it transforms education from a history of institutions into a history of relationships between knowledge, people, and society. The origins of design education therefore lie not only in schools but in the emergence of intentional learning itself. To study education in this way is also to reconsider what it means to teach. Every act of guidance shapes future actions, future decisions, and future possibilities. Even the earliest lessons carried social consequences, determining what knowledge survived, what skills developed, and how communities evolved. Education did not simply emerge from civilization. It actively participated in the formation of civilization itself. In the next chapter, we will move from informal learning to organized apprenticeship. We will examine how workshops became classrooms, how masters became teachers, and how practical knowledge began to be transmitted through structured intergenerational relationships. The discussion will shift from observation to apprenticeship, from participation to mentorship, and from shared experience to organized instruction. Once learning became embedded in workshops and craft traditions, design education was no longer simply about acquiring skills. It became a framework through which expertise itself could be preserved and expanded. This concludes Chapter 1 of Teaching the Designer, Before Schools. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.